My name is Cassidy Nolan, and I'm 28 years old. 4 weeks ago, my parents sold my grandmother's antique piano, the one she had promised would belong to me, and used every dollar of the $95,000 they got for it to buy my younger sister a brand new Mercedes. They assumed my grandmother was too sick in the nursing home to ever find out, and they assumed I was too weak to tell her. They were wrong. When I finally told my grandmother what they had done, she didn't cry. She didn't shout. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she reached for her phone, dialed one number, and calmly spoke 7 words that would destroy everything my parents believed they owned. Before I tell you what those 7 words were, and what happened a few days later at my mother's 60th birthday party, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. But only if you genuinely enjoy stories like this. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, let me take you back to the day everything started. The afternoon my grandmother was moved into hospice care. The phone call came on a Tuesday, just after my last piano lesson of the day. I had been packing up sheet music while one of my students struggled to remember the difference between a quarter note and a half note. My phone buzzed. My father's name lit up the screen. I answered immediately. "Your grandmother had another heart attack." He said, "No greeting, no concern, just information. She's stable, but they're transferring her to hospice. Family meeting at the hospital in an hour." I dropped everything. By the time I arrived, my parents and my sister were already gathered in a corner of the waiting room, speaking quietly like they didn't want anyone else to hear. My father, Martin Nolan, stood with his arms crossed, his expression tight and impatient. My mother, Elaine, clutched her designer handbag like it was some kind of shield. And my sister Brittany, 4 years younger than me and the unquestioned favorite in our family, was leaning against the wall scrolling through her phone, barely looking up. "Good. You're here," my father said when he saw me. Not, "How are you doing?" Not, "This must be hard. Just business. We need to divide responsibilities." He spoke like he was assigning tasks in a staff meeting. "Someone needs to visit your grandmother every day," he said. "Elaine and I have the business to run. Brittany's at an important stage with Jason's family. Jason Walker, Brittany's boyfriend of 8 months, the son of my father's most important business partner." My father turned to me. "So, Cassidy," he said, looking at me the way people look at someone they're about to give extra chores to. "You'll handle the visits. Your schedule is flexible. Teachers don't exactly work overtime." I wanted to tell him that I taught music to 37 children every week, that I ran after-school programs, that my time mattered too. But the words stayed in my throat. "Of course," I said quietly. "I want to be with her anyway." "Perfect," my father replied, already turning away as if the conversation were finished. "Keep us updated if anything changes." I nodded and walked down the hallway toward my grandmother's room, and just before I turned the corner, I heard my mother's voice behind me, soft, but not soft enough. Her words were meant for Brittany alone. At least Cassidy's useful for something. The following section contains some fictional elements and is AI-assisted for storytelling and educational purposes, and is completely unrelated to any individual or group. I hope you enjoyed this story. If not, please get some rest, stay healthy, and see you again soon. I kept walking. I didn't turn around. Not because I hadn't heard my mother's words, but because I had heard versions of them my entire life. After a while, pain like that stops surprising you. It becomes background noise. Something you carry quietly so other people don't have to acknowledge it. My grandmother's room smelled like lavender and old books. That combination existed because she insisted on it. Hospice staff preferred everything to smell like disinfectant and antiseptic. But Grandma had waved that idea away the first day she arrived. "If I'm going to die," she told me during my first visit, I'm going to do it surrounded by things I actually love. Her name was Margaret Nolan. She was 76 years old, sharp-minded, stubborn, and slowly losing a battle with congestive heart failure. The doctors had been honest with us. Weeks. They said, maybe a month or two if we were lucky. I visited her every afternoon after finishing my lessons. We talked about music most of the time, about the years she spent performing in small concert halls across the Northeast, about the students I taught who couldn't yet read sheet music, but somehow already felt rhythm in their bones. Those conversations were the only place in my life where I didn't feel like an afterthought. One evening, about a week after she moved into hospice, Grandma reached across the bed and took my hand. Her grip was weaker than I remembered, but her eyes were still sharp and alert. "Cassidy," she said quietly, "there's something I need you to know. Anything. Grandma, the Steinway." She paused, letting the word hang in the air. My mother's piano, the one built in 1892. Of course I knew the piano. I had learned my first scales on those ivory keys when I was 7 years old. I could still remember the smooth feel of the worn keys beneath my fingers and the deep, rich sound that filled the living room whenever Grandma played. That piano had been the soundtrack of my childhood. It was the only place in our house where I had ever truly felt seen. "It's yours," she said firmly. I blinked. "Grandma, I've already told your parents," she continued. "I told Martin and Elaine last month, in front of everyone." I remembered that dinner. My father's jaw tightening, my mother exchanging a quick glance with my sister, Brittany rolling her eyes and muttering something under her breath about sentimental junk. "Grandma, you don't have to give it to me," I said softly. "I want to." She squeezed my hand again, surprising me with the strength still hiding in her fingers. "You're the only one in this family who understands what that piano means," she said. "Promise me you'll take care of it, I promise." She smiled then, the kind of small, knowing smile that made it seem like she understood far more than she was saying out loud. "There are things in this world more valuable than money, Cassidy," she murmured, "and there are people who only learn that lesson the hard way." 2 weeks later, everything changed. Grandma asked me to bring some old photographs from her house, pictures from her performing years, black and white images of concert halls, programs, and newspaper clippings she wanted to see one last time. I still had a key to the house, so after my lessons ended on a rainy Thursday afternoon, I drove across town to get them. The house was quiet when I arrived, the kind of quiet that made every step echo. Rain tapped against the windows as I walked through the front door and into the familiar hallway. I passed the dining room, then I stepped into the living room, and stopped, because the corner where the Steinway piano had stood for nearly 30 years was empty. The house was quiet, too quiet. I stepped through the front door and into the foyer, shaking rain from my coat. The familiar scent of polished wood and old sheet music still hung faintly in the air. I walked past the dining room and toward the living room where the Steinway had stood for nearly 30 years. Then I stopped. The space was empty. For a moment, I actually forgot how to breathe, where the piano should have been. There was only a rectangular indentation pressed into the carpet, the faint outline of 4 heavy legs, the ghost of something that had lived there for decades and had been ripped away. My hands started trembling as I pulled out my phone. I called my mother. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello, Mom." My voice cracked despite my effort to steady it. "Where is Grandma's piano?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then her voice returned, casual and dismissive. "Your father handled that." My stomach tightened. "Handled it how, Cassidy?" "These are adult matters," she said coolly. "You don't need to worry about it." "Where is it?" I pressed. I said, "Don't worry about it." The line went dead. She had hung up. I stood in that empty living room for what felt like hours, staring at the indentation in the carpet while rain tapped steadily against the windows. Thunder rolled somewhere far away. Eventually, I forced myself to move. That evening, I drove straight to my parents' house. My father, Martin Nolan, opened the door with a glass of scotch in his hand. He looked mildly irritated, like I had interrupted something more important. The piano, I said immediately. What did you do with it? He didn't even hesitate. Sold it. He said, got $95,000 for it. Good price. For a second the world seemed to tilt sideways. You sold it? I whispered. Grandma said it was mine. Your grandmother is dying. Cassidy. He took a slow sip of his drink. She doesn't need a piano. He shrugged. And neither do you. Behind him I heard the light metallic jingle of car keys. My sister Brittany stepped into the hallway, grinning from ear to ear. She held up a set of keys and shook them proudly. New keys, she said brightly. For a new car? My voice came out flat. You bought her a car with Grandma's piano? My father shrugged again as if we were discussing something trivial like groceries. Mercedes-Benz. He said, Brittany needs to make the right impression on the Callaways. Ethan's family cares about appearances. That name twisted in my chest. Ethan Callaway, Brittany's boyfriend and the son of my father's most valuable business partner. That piano was supposed to be mine. I said quietly. And what exactly would you do with it? My mother asked from behind him. Elaine Nolan stepped forward, arms crossed tightly across her chest. You teach children's music classes. Cassidy, you don't perform. You don't have room for something like that. She glanced toward Brittany. Your sister needed that money for her future. Her future. I repeated slowly. The words tasted bitter in my mouth. Brittany strolled into the foyer, swinging the car keys like a trophy. Don't be jealous, Cassidy, she said with a wide, polished smile. It's not a good look. She tilted her head slightly. Maybe if you'd chosen a better career, you could afford nice things too. I looked at the three of them standing there together. My father, my mother, my sister. The family where Brittany was always the center of everything, and I was the extra piece no one quite knew what to do with. Does Grandma know? I asked. Silence. I looked directly at my father. Does she know you sold her piano? My mother's expression hardened instantly. She's in hospice. Cassidy, she said sharply. She's on morphine half the time. She doesn't need to hear anything that would upset her. You mean, you don't want her to know? My mother stepped closer. Her voice dropped lower. Colder. I mean that if you tell her something that causes her stress and something happens to her, she let the sentence hang in the air. That will be on you. Her eyes locked onto mine. Do you really want to be responsible for killing your grandmother? The accusation hung between us like poison. The old version of me would have backed down. I had done it 100 times before, but something inside me had finally cracked. Grandma has a right to know what happened to her property, I said quietly, and I'm not going to lie to her. I turned and walked out before they could answer. That night I didn't sleep. My apartment felt smaller than usual. A modest one-bedroom that my parents had always mocked as proof of my poor life choices. I sat on my second-hand couch staring at a framed photograph on the bookshelf. It was my grandmother Margaret at her final concert 20 years ago. Her hands poised above the Steinway keys, her face glowing with purpose. The same piano my parents had sold like it meant nothing, and the same piano she had promised would one day be mine. Her fingers hovered above the piano keys in the photograph. Her face bright with focus and purpose. It was the same Steinway my parents had sold like it meant nothing. I stared at the picture for a long time. the soft lamplight reflecting off the glass frame. My mother's words kept echoing in my head. If something happens, that will be on you. Was she right? If I told Grandma the truth? Would the shock hurt her? Would I be adding more pain to the final days of her life? I closed my eyes and leaned back against the couch, trying to breathe through the knot in my chest. Then I remembered something Grandma had told me years ago. I was 12 at the time and terrified to admit to my parents that I had failed a math test. I had begged her not to tell them. She listened quietly and then said something that stayed with me ever since. Truth can wound, Cassidy, but lies always wound deeper. They just take longer. I pulled my knees up against my chest and sat there in silence. I thought about the last 28 years of my life, every moment when I had stayed quiet to keep the peace. Every time I accepted less because arguing felt pointless. Every time I made myself smaller so the rest of my family could feel bigger. And where had that gotten me? Here, alone in a small apartment, invisible in my own family. Watching them erase my grandmother's wishes like her voice meant nothing. If I stayed silent now, I wasn't protecting anyone. I was helping them get away with it. By 3 a.m, my decision was made. Grandma deserved the truth. She deserved to know that her own son had stolen from her, lied to her, and assumed she was too weak to matter anymore. And maybe, just maybe, I deserved to stop apologizing for existing. I set my alarm for early morning. I would go to the hospice center before my first lesson of the day. I would tell her everything. When I arrived the next morning, Grandma Margaret was already awake. She was propped up against a stack of pillows, looking out the window as the sunrise painted the sky in pale orange and gold. When she saw me step into the room, she smiled gently. "You look like you didn't sleep," she said. I didn't. I pulled a chair closer to the bed and took her hand. Her skin felt thin and cool, but her grip tightened slightly around my fingers. "Grandma," I said quietly, "I need to tell you something, and it's going to hurt." Her eyes studied my face. Even after everything, they were still sharp and clear. "Then tell me." So I did. I told her about the empty space in the living room where the Steinway had stood. I told her about the $95,000, about the Mercedes sitting in Brittany's name, about my father's careless dismissal, about my mother's warning. I told her everything. As I spoke, I prepared myself for tears, for anger, for the kind of devastation that might shatter what little strength she had left. But when I finished, Grandma Margaret simply exhaled slowly. Not a gasp of shock, not a cry of betrayal, just a long, quiet sigh. The sigh of someone who had expected this all along. "Grandma," I whispered. She turned her head toward me. Her expression was calm, almost resigned. "I thought something like this might happen. Sweetheart, you knew I know my son." Her voice was steady. "I've watched Martin become this person for 40 years. I hoped he might change someday, but I also prepared myself for the possibility that he wouldn't." My mind started racing. Prepared how, instead of answering. She reached slowly toward the bedside table. "Would you hand me my phone?" I picked it up and placed it gently in her hand. She unlocked it with surprising ease and began scrolling through her contacts. Then she stopped on a name and pressed the call button. A few seconds later, she tapped the screen and placed the phone on speaker. 3 rings. Then a man's voice answered, deep and calm. "Margaret, how are you feeling today? If you think I did the right thing by telling my grandmother the truth instead of staying silent, leave a 1 in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think." And I read every single one. Sometimes the quietest act of courage is simply choosing honesty. "Margaret, how are you feeling?" The voice on the phone was deep, calm, and measured. Grandma Margaret didn't hesitate. "I'm dying." Harold, she said simply, but my mind is clear, and it's time. There was a short pause on the other end of the line. I understand. The man replied. When he asked, Sunday, Grandma said. Elaine's birthday party. At my house? Another pause. I'll prepare the documents, the man said. Thank you, old friend. Grandma ended the call and set the phone down gently on the bedside table. Then she looked at me with a small, knowing smile. I stared at her, completely confused. Grandma, who is Harold Jennings? She said calmly. He's been my attorney for 30 years. He was your grandfather's closest friend. You have your own attorney, I asked. She let out a soft, tired laugh. Oh, sweetheart, she said. I have many things your father doesn't know about. Her eyes sparkled faintly despite the exhaustion carved into her face. Martin has always believed he understands everything about my affairs. She continued. He's always believed that. She paused for a moment. That has always been his greatest weakness. I sat there, feeling like I had stepped onto the edge of something enormous, something I couldn't quite see yet. What's going to happen on Sunday? I asked slowly. At Mom's birthday party, Grandma Margaret squeezed my hand. Justice. The word was quiet but firm. Delayed, perhaps, she added. But justice nonetheless. I don't understand. You don't need to understand everything yet, she said gently. She leaned back against her pillows, suddenly looking much more tired than before. I just need you to do one thing for me. Anything. Come to the party, she said. Dress nicely, and bring your patience. A faint smile touched her lips. The same patience I taught you when you were learning Chopin and wanted to throw the sheet music across the room, despite everything. I almost laughed. That bad worse, she said softly. Her expression grew more serious again. But necessary. She looked straight at me. Your father and mother need to learn that actions have consequences. Then she added quietly. And I've spent 5 years making sure that when the lesson finally arrives, it will be unforgettable. 5 years. The number echoed in my head. You've been planning something for 5 years, I whispered. Grandma, what did you do? She didn't answer. Instead, she closed her eyes slowly as exhaustion began to overtake her. I protected you, sweetheart, she murmured softly, the way I should have protected you all along. Her voice grew faint. I'm only sorry it took me so long. Within a few minutes, she had fallen asleep. I stayed beside her bed, holding her hand while my mind spun with questions. Harold Jennings. Sunday. My mother's birthday party. And my grandmother's house. Something was coming. I could feel it. I just didn't know what it would be. 2 days later, I found myself sitting in a small law office on the outskirts of Philadelphia. The brass nameplate on the door read, Harold Jennings, attorney at law. The office inside smelled faintly of old leather and paper. Tall shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with thick legal books whose pages had probably been turned thousands of times. Harold Jennings was nothing like I expected. He looked to be in his late 60s, with neatly combed silver hair and thin gold-rimmed glasses. His movements were slow but deliberate, like a man who had learned long ago that patience was more powerful than speed. When he entered the room, he offered me his hand. Cassidy Nolan, he said warmly. Your grandmother speaks about you often. He smiled kindly. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. He said again. Mr. Jennings. Harold. Please. He interrupted gently. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Sit. I lowered myself into the chair. suddenly aware that my hands were trembling slightly. The office felt quiet in a way that made every small sound seem louder. The rustle of paper, the ticking of a clock somewhere behind me. Your grandmother asked me to explain a few things before Sunday, Harold said calmly. I nodded. Your grandmother is a remarkable woman, he continued, and she is far more perceptive than her children have ever given her credit for. He folded his hands neatly on the desk. For years she has been observing, watching, planning. Planning what exactly, I asked. Instead of answering immediately, he studied me for a moment. Tell me something. Cassidy, he said. Do you know who owns the house your parents live in? I blinked in confusion. They do, I said automatically. Grandma gave it to them after my grandfather passed away. Harold's expression didn't change. Is that what they told you? That's what everyone says. Everyone, Harold replied quietly. Is wrong. He opened a drawer in his desk and removed a thick folder. Then he slid it across the desk toward me. Your grandmother allowed Martin and Elaine to live in that house rent-free, he said, but she never transferred ownership. Not legally, he added. Not ever. I stared down at the document inside the folder, a property deed. The name printed clearly across the top, Margaret Nolan. There were no amendments, no transfer forms, no signatures passing ownership to my parents. They've been living in her house for 10 years, I said slowly, trying to process it, thinking it was theirs. Precisely. My head felt like it was spinning, but why would Grandma let them believe that I asked? Harold leaned forward slightly, because she was watching. He said, watching to see if her son would prove her fears wrong. His voice softened slightly. Unfortunately, he did exactly what she expected. I left Harold's office that afternoon with more questions than answers. That night, I returned to my apartment and began searching through an old wooden box my grandmother had given me years ago. I had never looked through it properly before. The box contained photographs, letters, dried flowers she had pressed from her garden. It always felt too personal, almost like reading someone's diary. But now I needed to understand. I sifted through the contents slowly until I found it near the bottom of the box. A sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. My name was written across the front in my grandmother's careful handwriting. Cassidy. Beneath it were 6 smaller words. For Cassidy. When you need to understand? My fingers trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph and a copy of a legal document. The top portion of the document was partially covered, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Margaret Nolan. The date beside it was from 5 years ago. Attached to the corner was a small handwritten note from her. The house never left my hands. Sweetheart. It was only borrowed, and some borrowers don't deserve the privilege. I read the note 3 times before the meaning finally settled in. Sunday's birthday party was being held at my grandmother's house, the same house my parents treated like their own. The house where they hosted dinner parties and holiday gatherings. The house where they sold the Steinway piano that had sat in the living room for 30 years, as if it belonged to them. But it didn't belong to them. It never had. My father had built his entire sense of success on a foundation that wasn't real. I thought about every lecture he had ever given me about smart investments and financial responsibility. Every time he mocked my small apartment. Every time he talked about real assets, all while living inside a home that legally wasn't his. The irony was almost overwhelming. I carefully placed the letter back into its envelope and set it on my nightstand. Sunday was only 3 days away. Whatever my grandmother had planned, it was going to happen in the very house my parents believed they controlled, and they had absolutely no idea what was coming. The night before the party, my phone rang. Grandma Margaret. Her voice sounded weaker than before. I could hear the strain behind every word, but her mind was still sharp. "Cassidy," she said softly. "Are you ready for tomorrow, Cassidy? Are you ready for tomorrow?" My grandmother's voice on the phone was softer than usual, but it still carried the quiet strength I had always known. "I think so," I said. Then I hesitated. "Grandma, are you sure about this? It's Mom's birthday, and there will be a lot of people there. That is exactly why it needs to happen tomorrow," she replied. She paused to catch her breath. "Your father sold my piano in front of everyone at that family dinner last month." She continued slowly. "He announced it like it was his decision to make." Her voice remained calm, but I could hear the weight behind every word. "He didn't ask me, and he certainly didn't think about you." I closed my eyes. "I remember." "Then you understand why this lesson needs witnesses," she said. Her voice softened. "I'm not doing this for revenge, Cassidy. Revenge is empty." Another pause. "I'm doing this because it's right, and because you deserve to be protected, especially after I'm gone." Tears burned behind my eyes. "Grandma, I should have said something sooner," she whispered. "I watched the way they treated you for years, and I kept hoping Martin would change." She sighed quietly. "That was my mistake. Love made me blind for too long." "It's not your fault," I said quickly. "Maybe not entirely," she answered. "But I can still make things right." For a moment the line went quiet except for the faint sound of her breathing. "I don't have much time left, Cassidy," she said gently. "The doctors say a few weeks, but I think it's less. I can feel it." Her voice grew softer. "So I need to know something. Anything. Do you trust me always?" I said without hesitation. "Then come tomorrow," she replied. "Wear something that makes you feel strong." She paused again before adding one final sentence. "And no matter what happens, remember that you are not the villain in this story. You never were." We said goodnight after that. I held the phone against my chest for a long time after the call ended. Tomorrow would change everything. I just had to be ready to let it. Sunday arrived with pale winter sunlight and the kind of crisp air that made everything feel sharper and more real. My grandmother's house looked almost festive. A large banner reading "Happy 60th Birthday." Elaine hung across the porch railing. Cars lined the driveway and spilled out along the street. I parked near the end of the block and sat in my car for a moment. Taking a slow breath, I had chosen a navy blue dress. Simple but elegant. The pearl earrings my grandmother had given me on my 21st birthday rested against my neck. My hair was pinned neatly back. It felt like armor for a battle I didn't fully understand yet. When I stepped inside, the house buzzed with conversation. About 30 people had already gathered. Aunts and uncles I only saw at holidays, old neighbors, several of my father's business associates. Near the fireplace, I spotted Ethan Calloway and his father talking quietly. Brittany stood beside Ethan with her arm looped through his, smiling brightly. But my eyes were immediately drawn to the living room. The corner where the Steinway had stood for 30 years was empty. Someone had placed a large potted plant there, as if greenery could somehow fill the absence. It looked ridiculous. A leafy apology for something that could never really be replaced. Across the room, my mother Elaine stood near the dining table in a red designer dress, accepting compliments as if she were royalty receiving tribute. My father Martin moved easily through the crowd, greeting guests with his usual practiced charm. And in the far corner of the room, almost unnoticed among the guests, sat Harold Jennings. His leather briefcase rested beside his chair. He caught my eye from across the room and gave me a nearly invisible nod. I nodded back. A moment later, my great-aunt Clara, my grandmother's younger sister, appeared beside me. "Cassidy, sweetheart," she said softly. "How is Margaret? Really tired?" I answered honestly, but still sharp. She always was the clever one. Aunt Clara said. Her eyes drifted across the room. I noticed the piano is gone. Aunt Clara, I heard Margaret wanted to sell it. Someone nearby said. I opened my mouth to respond, but my father's voice suddenly cut through the room. Everyone, if I could have your attention. Please. Martin Nolan stepped into the center of the living room with a crystal glass raised in his hand, commanding the space like it belonged to him. Which, I now knew, it didn't. Today, he announced proudly, we celebrate 60 wonderful years of Elaine Nolan. Applause broke out around the room. My mother smiled brightly, basking in the attention. And, my father continued, I'd like to share some exciting family news. My stomach dropped. As many of you know, our daughter Brittany has been seeing Ethan Calloway, the son of my dear friend and business partner Robert Calloway. He gestured toward Ethan, who nodded politely beside Brittany, to celebrate her bright future. My father continued, we have a special surprise. He motioned toward the front door. Everyone, come outside. Guests began filing toward the driveway, curious murmurs filling the air. I followed slowly, my chest tightening with every step. Parked in the driveway was a gleaming silver Mercedes-Benz. A large red bow sat perfectly centered on the hood. A gift, my father announced proudly. Made possible by Margaret Nolan's generosity. My throat tightened. She chose to sell her antique piano, he continued, to invest in her granddaughter's future. Brittany squealed with excitement. She threw her arms around my father and laughed as guests applauded. Cameras came out. Someone began taking photos while Brittany posed beside the car like it was a prize she had won. I stood frozen on the porch. He was doing it again, rewriting the story, turning himself into the hero while completely erasing my grandmother's wishes. A woman standing near the driveway leaned toward her husband and whispered quietly, wasn't that piano supposed to go to the other granddaughter, the music teacher? Her husband shrugged. Plans must have changed. Aunt Clara appeared beside me, her face pale. Cassidy, she whispered. Did Margaret really agree to this before I could answer? Brittany spotted me. Oh, Cassidy, she called out sweetly, her voice dripping with false kindness. Come take a picture with us. She waved her keys playfully. Don't be jealous. I'm sure Grandma will leave you something too. She laughed lightly. Maybe her collection of old sheet music. A few scattered chuckles rippled through the crowd. My hands started shaking. My vision blurred as tears threatened to fall. But I forced them back. And then, behind me, I heard the quiet click of a briefcase opening. Guests began moving back inside the house, but before my father could follow them, Aunt Clara stepped directly into his path. Martin, she said calmly. Her voice was steady. But I noticed her hands trembling slightly. I need to ask you something. My father's smile remained fixed in place. Can it wait? Clara, we're in the middle of a celebration. Did you ask Margaret before you sold that piano? The question dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Nearby conversations faltered and faded. Mother is in hospice, my father replied smoothly. She's not in a condition to handle decisions like that. We did what was best for her. He lifted his chin. I spoke with her this morning. Aunt Clara straightened. She's perfectly clear-headed. Martin, she said firmly, completely lucid. Her voice grew stronger, and she told me you never asked her permission. Silence spread through the room. I saw Robert Calloway frown slightly. Ethan shifted uncomfortably beside Brittany. My mother stepped forward quickly, her face flushed. Clara, this is my birthday. Let's not create a scene. A scene? Aunt Clara laughed softly. But there was no humor in it. Elaine, Your husband sold Margaret's most precious possession without her knowledge and used the money to buy a car. She gestured toward the driveway. If anyone created a scene here, it wasn't me. The room fell completely silent. 30 pairs of eyes moved back and forth between my parents and Aunt Clara. My father's composure cracked just slightly. "This is a private family matter," he said sharply. "It doesn't need to be discussed in public." "Actually," another voice said calmly behind us, "I think public is exactly where it should be discussed." I turned. Harold Jennings was standing now. His briefcase was open, a folder of documents resting in his hands. He walked slowly toward the center of the living room with the calm confidence of someone who had done this many times before. "Good afternoon, everyone," he said clearly. "My name is Harold Jennings. I am Margaret Nolan's attorney." My father's face went completely pale. The silence in the room became suffocating. Harold positioned himself carefully near the empty corner where the Steinway piano had once stood. The choice felt deliberate. "I apologize for interrupting the celebration," he continued calmly. "However, Margaret Nolan has asked me to address several urgent matters concerning her estate. Given the circumstances," he added, "she felt it was important that her family and close associates hear this information directly." My father spoke first. "My mother has an attorney." "Since when?" "Since 30 years ago." "Martin." Harold replied politely. His tone remained calm, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. "I also represented your father." He paused slightly. "You would know that, if you had ever bothered to ask." Muffled gasps spread through the room. Someone whispered behind me, "Oh my God." My mother stepped forward quickly. "Margaret is dying," she snapped. "She's not in her right mind. Whatever documents you think you have." Harold raised one hand gently, silencing her. "I visited Margaret this morning," he said. "Her nurse can confirm that she is fully competent and entirely lucid." He opened the folder and removed a document. "She personally instructed me to address this gathering today." He lifted the paper so everyone could see it. "There appears to be some confusion regarding property ownership." He held up the document. "This is the deed to the house we are currently standing in." I watched the color drain completely from my father's face. "Notice the name listed here," Harold said calmly. "Margaret Nolan." He looked directly at my parents. "Not Martin Nolan. Not Elaine Nolan." He paused long enough for the words to settle. "This property has never been transferred. It was never gifted. For the past 10 years. Your parents have simply been living here rent-free at Margaret Nolan's generosity. Nothing more." Whispers exploded throughout the room. My father grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. Brittany stared at him in shock. And Harold Jennings was not finished. "That," he said quietly, "is only the beginning. If you're still listening, you're probably holding your breath the same way I was in that moment." Before I tell you what Harold revealed next, let me ask you something. Who do you think actually owns that house? Option A. My parents. Because surely my grandmother must have transferred it to them at some point. Option B. My grandmother. Because there has been a secret all along. Or option C. Me. Because the biggest twist hasn't even happened yet. Drop your answer in the comments and keep listening. Because what happened next changed everything. My father's voice cracked as he stared at the document. "This is impossible," Martin said. "Mother told us the house was ours. She promised. She promised you could live here." Harold corrected calmly. He placed the deed flat on the dining table where everyone could see it. "There is a significant legal difference between living somewhere and owning it. Mr. Nolan." The realization began spreading through the room like wildfire. I saw Robert Calloway slowly take a step back from my father. One of the neighbors leaned toward her husband, whispering something under her breath. "For 10 years," Harold continued, You have lived in this property without paying rent, utilities, or property taxes. All of those expenses were covered directly by Margaret Nolan's accounts. His voice remained steady. You treated this home as if it were yours. You even made structural changes without permission. He glanced toward the ceiling where the modern light fixtures my mother installed last year now hung. Legally speaking, you are tenants at will, and the property owner has the right to terminate that arrangement at any time. You cannot be serious, my mother said sharply. We have lived here for a decade. We have invested in this house, invested without authorization. Harold replied. His expression did not change. Any modifications made without written consent legally belong to the property owner. Margaret Nolan. Brittany grabbed Ethan's arm. This is insane. She said, Dad, tell them this is some kind of joke. But my father couldn't speak. He stood there staring at the deed as if it were a death sentence. There is also another matter worth mentioning. Harold continued almost casually. Pennsylvania law takes property fraud very seriously. Representing someone else's property as your own, particularly in business dealings, can carry significant legal consequences. I watched Robert Calloway's expression change. Just moments earlier, he had been smiling politely beside my father. Now he was looking at him very differently, not like a partner, like a liability. The image my father had carefully built over the years was starting to crumble right in front of everyone. And Harold Jennings still had more papers in his folder. Now, he said, removing a second document. We must address the matter of the trust. What trust? My father asked hoarsely. 5 years ago, Harold said, Margaret Nolan established a separate legal trust independent of the will previously shared with the family. He looked around the room before continuing. This trust was created specifically to protect her most valuable assets in the event of financial misconduct. Financial misconduct, my mother sputtered. We are her family. Family members are fully capable of misconduct, Harold replied calmly. As recent events have clearly demonstrated, he lifted the document in his hands. According to the terms of this trust, the following assets are irrevocably assigned to a single beneficiary. He began listing them one by one. The house we are currently standing in, Margaret Nolan's financial accounts, and all items of sentimental value, including the 1892 Steinway piano that was recently sold without authorization. Then he looked up. His eyes settled directly on me. The sole beneficiary is Cassidy Nolan. The room fell completely silent. Then Brittany screamed. What? That's fraud, my father shouted immediately. She manipulated her, that little Martin. Harold's voice turned cold. I strongly advise you to choose your next words carefully. He gestured calmly toward the room. Everything said here today has been witnessed by more than 30 people. Aunt Clara stepped beside me and squeezed my hand. Margaret knew exactly what she was doing, she said quietly. Harold continued speaking. For 5 years, Margaret Nolan observed her family. She waited. She hoped her son would prove her wrong. He paused. Instead, he sold her most treasured possession to purchase a luxury vehicle for the granddaughter who rarely visits her. He looked directly at my father. Actions have consequences. Mr. Nolan. My mother had begun crying. Brittany looked pale, like she might faint, and I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Harold allowed the room to absorb the shock before continuing. Regarding the sale of the Steinway piano, he said, pulling out another document. Because the piano was part of the trust and Cassidy Nolan is the designated beneficiary. The sale conducted without trustee consent constitutes unauthorized disposal of trust property. Brittany's voice came out small and shaky. What does that mean? It means, Harold replied calmly, that the $95,000 obtained from that sale must be returned to the trust within 30 days. His eyes moved slowly across my parents and sister. If repayment is not made within that period, civil litigation will begin for misappropriation of trust assets. He paused. Given the documentation involved, the outcome would not be favorable for your family. My father laughed suddenly. It was a hollow, desperate sound. We don't have $95,000 sitting around, he said. The money went to the car. Harold nodded toward the window. Outside, the silver Mercedes still sat in the driveway with its red bow. Then I suggest liquidating that asset, he said calmly. The dealership may accept a return, although you will likely incur a significant loss. Brittany burst into tears. My car. You're taking my car. I'm not taking anything. Miss Nolan, Harold replied. I'm simply explaining the legal consequences of your family's choices. Brittany looked desperately toward Ethan, but he had already taken a step away from her. His expression had gone carefully neutral. Robert Calloway leaned down and whispered something to his son. Neither of them looked sympathetic anymore. And finally, Harold continued, Margaret Nolan has asked me to inform you that your living arrangement in this property will now be formally restructured. My mother's voice barely came out. Restructured. You may remain here temporarily, Harold said, but a formal lease agreement will be required. A lease, she whispered. In the house we've lived in for 10 years, Harold nodded slightly. In the house? He corrected gently. That you never owned. The room fell completely silent. Every single pair of eyes in the house turned toward me. My father slowly turned in my direction, his face twisted with anger and disbelief. You did this, Martin said hoarsely. You poisoned her against us. I didn't move. No. Dad. I said calmly. I didn't do anything. My voice was steadier than I expected it to be. Grandma made those decisions 5 years ago, long before I knew anything about them. I only found out this week. Liar. My mother snapped. Elaine's voice shook with bitterness. You've always been jealous of Brittany, jealous of this family and everything we built. This is your revenge. Revenge. Something inside me hardened. I didn't sell Grandma's piano without asking her. I said quietly. I didn't spend the money on a car for myself. And I didn't lie to everyone about what really happened. I took a step forward and looked directly at my mother. I'm not the one who said, at least she's useful for something, when I agreed to visit Grandma every day. A wave of shocked murmurs passed through the room. And I'm not the one who hung up the phone when I asked what happened to her piano. I held her gaze. And I'm definitely not the one who threatened me by saying I would be responsible for killing Grandma if I told her the truth. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Aunt Clara's hand tightened around mine. For the first time in my life, I didn't look away. I spent 28 years invisible in this family. I continued quietly. I accepted it because I thought that was what love meant. Making yourself smaller so everyone else can feel bigger. I looked at my father, then my mother, then Brittany, who was still crying somewhere near the doorway about the car she was about to lose. But Grandma taught me something different. I said, she taught me that loving yourself sometimes means standing up for what is right, even when it costs you everything. I took a slow breath. So here is what I want you to understand. I'm not apologizing anymore. I'm not staying silent anymore. And I'm done pretending everything is fine when it isn't. The room remained absolutely still. No one said a word. One by one, guests began quietly gathering their coats. People avoided eye contact as they slipped toward the door. Soft whispers filled the air as the crowd slowly disappeared. Within minutes, the house that had been full of voices felt strangely hollow. Harold gently touched my arm. Cassidy, he said quietly. We should discuss the next steps. I nodded, still feeling like I was watching everything from outside my own body. Legally speaking, Harold continued softly so only I could hear. You have several options. You could demand immediate eviction, given the circumstances. Your grandmother would absolutely support that decision. I looked across the room. My father had collapsed into a chair, his head buried in his hands. My mother stood frozen near the window. Mascara streaked down her face. Brittany had vanished outside, probably still crying beside the Mercedes. They looked broken. Part of me wanted revenge. A small, wounded part of me wanted them to feel every bit of the pain they had caused me for 28 years. But that wasn't the person I wanted to become. I don't want to throw them out, I said quietly. Not immediately. Harold raised an eyebrow. Are you certain? Yes. I inhaled slowly. Here's what I want. The $95,000 gets returned within 90 days. Not 30. I'll give them time to sell the car and figure things out. They can remain in the house under a formal lease agreement with minimal rent. My voice faltered for just a moment. And after Grandma? I swallowed hard. After she passes, they'll have 12 months to find somewhere else to live. Harold studied me carefully. That is remarkably generous. Given everything that has happened? Maybe. I said. But I'm not doing this to punish them. I'm doing it because it's right, and because I refuse to become the kind of person they are. For a long moment he said nothing. Then Harold nodded slowly. Your grandmother told me you would respond this way. His expression softened. She is very proud of you. Cassidy. My voice cracked. I know. The agreement was written right there on the dining room table. Aunt Clara and 2 remaining guests stayed as witnesses. My father signed the paper without looking at me. My mother's hands shook so badly she could barely hold the pen. Neither of them spoke. By the time the last signature was finished, the house was nearly empty. Robert Calloway and Ethan had already left without saying goodbye. Later, I learned Ethan had driven away while Brittany was still outside crying. The birthday cake sat untouched on the table. The banner on the porch hung crooked and forgotten. Aunt Clara hugged me tightly before she left. You did the right thing, sweetheart, she whispered. Margaret would be so proud. She is proud, I said softly. I spoke with her this morning, almost as if she heard us. My phone buzzed. A video call from the hospice center. I answered it while walking slowly to the empty corner of the living room where the Steinway had once stood. My grandmother's face appeared on the screen. She looked pale, but peaceful. Nurse Carol stood behind her with a warm smile. My brave girl, Grandma Margaret said softly. How do you feel? Terrified, I admitted. And relieved. And sad. She smiled gently. That's what courage feels like. Sweetheart, it's never comfortable. I didn't throw them out, I said. I gave them time. I know. She replied. Harold already texted me. Her eyes shimmered with emotion. You are a better person than they deserve. Cassidy. But that is exactly why I chose you. I pressed my hand against the screen, wishing I could hold her hand instead. Thank you, Grandma, for everything, for protecting me. Don't thank me, she said softly. Just live well, play music, be happy. That will be thanks enough. I will, I whispered. I know you will, she said. Her eyes slowly closed. I know you will. And now you might be wondering something. Did my parents ever change? The truth is complicated. Not every story ends neatly. But every story leaves you with a lesson. Before I tell you what happened in the months that followed, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had to set boundaries with your own family? Was it difficult? Share your story in the comments. I read every single one. I read every single comment you left. And in the first week after the party, everything fell apart faster than I could have imagined. News travels quickly in tight social circles. And the story of what happened at Elaine Nolan's 60th birthday spread through our community like wildfire. My father's business partners suddenly became very busy. Meetings were postponed. Phone calls went unanswered. People who had once treated him like a rising success now seemed strangely unavailable. Robert Calloway officially withdrew from the joint venture he and my father had been negotiating for months. When my father demanded an explanation, the answer he received was blunt. "I can't do business with someone I can't trust." Then Robert added something even colder. "Martin, if you're willing to deceive your own mother, what would you do to a business partner?" The deal would have been worth more than $200,000. It disappeared overnight. Brittany was forced to return the Mercedes. The dealership offered them only $80,000, $15,000 less than what my parents had paid. She screamed at the salesman for nearly 20 minutes before finally signing the return papers. 3 days later, Ethan ended things. Not in person, not even with a phone call. A text message. "My family thinks it's best if we take some time apart." The translation was obvious. The Calloways wanted nothing to do with the Nolan family scandal, for the first time in her life. Brittany was ordinary. No luxury car, no wealthy boyfriend, no special treatment. She had to borrow my mother's old Honda just to drive to job interviews. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call. I didn't even mention it. I simply continued living my life. I taught my students their scales and finger exercises. I visited Grandma Margaret every evening, but I would be lying if I said I felt nothing watching the illusion crumble. My father had spent years measuring success through appearances. The house, the car, the right connections. Now he was learning something he had never understood before. None of it had ever been his. The entire foundation of his identity had been borrowed, and borrowed things eventually have to be returned. 3 weeks after the birthday party, the hospice called me at 6 in the morning. "You should come now," the nurse said gently. "She's asking for you." I drove faster than I should have. My heart pounded the entire way there. When I arrived, the room was quiet. Soft morning light filtered through the curtains, painting golden shadows across the bed. Grandma Margaret looked fragile. Her breathing was shallow, her skin almost translucent, but her eyes were open, and when she saw me, she smiled. "My Cassidy," she whispered, "come sit with me." I took her hand carefully. It felt incredibly light, like holding a bird. "I have something I need to tell you," she said slowly. "Something I should have said years ago." "What is it?" "Grandma, I'm sorry." The word surprised me. Sorry for what? A tear slid slowly down her cheek. "I watched the way they treated you year after year," she said quietly. "I kept hoping Martin would change. I kept hoping Elaine would see how special you are." She swallowed. "I made excuses because I didn't want to believe my own son could become someone like that." Her voice faltered. "I should have protected you sooner." My own tears were falling now. "It's not your fault," I whispered. "Maybe not entirely," she said softly. "But I could have done more." Her fingers tightened weakly around mine. I waited until I was dying to act. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. You deserved better." I shook my head. "You gave me everything that mattered," I said. "Music, love, and the knowledge that I was worth something. That's more than they ever gave me." She smiled then, for just a moment. She looked like the grandmother I remembered from childhood. Strong, radiant, alive. "I'm so proud of you, Cassidy," she whispered. "You have a good heart." She paused. "But you finally learned how to protect it. You taught me that," I said softly. "Then I did something right." Her eyes slowly closed. "I'm tired now. Sweetheart, stay with me." "I'm right here," I said. Grandma Margaret passed away that evening. peacefully, with my hand in hers. 5 days later, we held her funeral at the small church she had attended for nearly 50 years. Just as she had requested. It was simple. No elaborate arrangements, no grand displays, only music, memories, and the people who truly loved her. I played the piano during the service, not the Steinway that had once stood in her living room. That was gone forever. Instead, I played the modest upright piano that belonged to the church. I performed Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the first piece Grandma ever taught me. The church was half full. Aunt Clara sat in the front row holding a handkerchief in trembling hands. Several of Grandma's old colleagues from her performing days filled the pews behind her. White-haired women who still remembered when Margaret Nolan's name meant something in the world of classical music. My parents sat in the very back. They didn't approach me before the service. They didn't approach me afterward either. My mother wore dark sunglasses the entire time. My father stared straight ahead like a man waiting for judgment. Brittany didn't attend. My mother quietly explained to someone that she was too emotionally fragile. I delivered the eulogy. I spoke about Grandma's music, her wisdom, her quiet strength. I spoke about the way she showed love, not through grand gestures, but through consistency, through showing up every day and truly seeing the people around you. I never mentioned the conflict. The funeral wasn't the place for that. After the service, my father began walking toward me. I saw him hesitate halfway across the room. Then my mother took his arm and gently pulled him away. He never reached me. Maybe he wanted to apologize. Maybe he didn't. I'll never know. But by then, I had already accepted something important. Some apologies never come. And sometimes, you don't need them anymore. 6 months later, I moved into my grandmother's house. At first it felt strange, walking through rooms filled with her presence, sleeping in the guest bedroom I had known since childhood. But slowly the house began to feel like home, using part of the money that had been returned to the trust. I bought a new piano, not a Steinway. Those cost far more than $95,000, but it was a beautiful Yamaha grand piano, and it stood proudly in the same corner where Grandma's Steinway had once lived. It was different from the Steinway, but meaningful in its own way. A new beginning. After I moved into Grandma Margaret's house, life slowly found a rhythm again. I started offering private piano lessons on weekends. At first it was just a few students, children from the neighborhood whose parents had heard about me through Aunt Clara. My first student was Clara's granddaughter, Sophie. She was 8 years old, bright-eyed and endlessly curious, with the same impatient energy I remembered having at her age. Her fingers stumbled across the keys at first, just as mine once had. The day she managed to play her first complete scale without stopping. She turned to me with a huge smile, and for some reason, I started crying. Not because of sadness, but because it felt like something beautiful was beginning again in that house. My parents moved out 2 months after Grandma passed away. They didn't stay for the full 12 months I had offered them. They said the house carried too many painful memories. Personally, I think they simply couldn't stand the reminder of everything they had lost. They bought a small condo across town. My father's business struggled for a while after the scandal. What remained of it eventually shrank to half the size it once had been. My mother joined a different social club, one where people didn't know the Nolan family history. We didn't speak anymore. Not out of anger exactly, just distance. Some gaps grow too wide to easily bridge. But I wasn't bitter. Bitterness is exhausting, and I had a life to build. In the evenings, I often sat at the piano until the sky darkened and the stars appeared outside the windows. Sometimes I played Chopin, sometimes Bach, sometimes melodies that didn't belong to anyone at all. Music that simply wandered wherever it wanted. Grandma Margaret was still present in those moments. In the lavender growing in the garden she had planted years ago. in the soft creak of the old wooden floors, in the way the sunlight spilled through the windows each evening. She was gone, but she was also everywhere, and for the first time in my life, I felt free. 8 months after the funeral, my phone rang. The name on the screen surprised me. Brittany. I stared at the phone through 3 full rings before finally answering. Cassidy, she said quietly. Her voice sounded different, smaller, less certain. Brittany. For a moment, neither of us spoke. 28 years of sisterhood had somehow been reduced to silence. I'm not calling to ask for anything, she said finally. I just wanted to say something. Okay, I replied gently. I've been thinking about everything that happened, she continued, about how I acted. She inhaled slowly. At first I was angry at you, at Grandma, at everyone. I thought you had taken something from me. Another pause. But now, her voice faltered slightly. Now I'm working at a marketing firm, entry level. I ride the bus because I can't afford a car. And I've started therapy. I didn't interrupt. I just listened. My therapist says I have a lot to unpack about Mom and Dad, she said with a soft, awkward laugh, about how I was raised, about why I believed I deserved everything without earning it. Her laugh faded. Turns out being the favorite child isn't actually a gift. It's a trap. I'm glad you're working through that, I said quietly. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she said quickly. Her voice cracked. I don't deserve that. I just wanted you to know that I understand now why you did what you did, and why Grandma did what she did. Grandma loved you too. Brittany, I said. She just couldn't reward behavior that hurt other people. I know, she whispered. I know that now. We sat in silence for a few seconds. If you ever want to talk again, I said slowly, I'm willing to listen, but trust takes time to rebuild. I understand, she said. Good. We ended the call without saying goodbye. Not because we were cold, but because neither of us quite knew how to close that conversation. Some doors open slowly after they've been shut, but they can still open. It is spring now, a full year since Grandma Margaret entered hospice. Tonight, I'm sitting at the piano as the sun sets behind the garden. The windows are open and a warm breeze carries the scent of jasmine and freshly cut grass through the room. I play Grandma's favorite nocturne, the one she performed at her final concert 20 years ago. The notes drift through the quiet house, soft and steady. As I play, I think about everything that happened. The betrayal, the truth that came out that day in the living room, the boundaries I never thought I would have the courage to draw. I think about Grandma, her strength, her patience, her quiet determination to protect me even when I didn't know I needed protecting. I think about my parents living in their small condo across town, rebuilding a life that looks nothing like the one they once imagined. I think about Brittany riding the bus to work every morning and learning for the first time what it means to earn something. I don't hate them. Hate takes too much energy, but I don't need them anymore either. And that kind of freedom is something I never expected to find. The nocturne ends. The final notes linger in the air before fading into the quiet evening. I look at the photograph resting on top of the piano. Grandma Margaret at 60 years old. Radiant, her hands hovering over the Steinway keys she loved so much. I'm doing okay, Grandma, I whisper. More than okay. Somewhere deep down. I like to believe she hears me. I close the piano lid and walk to the window. The first stars are beginning to appear in the darkening sky, small points of light scattered across the night. I don't have the original piano, and I don't have the family I thought I had. But I have something better. I have myself. I have boundaries. And I have a life built on truth instead of silence. That is the real inheritance my grandmother left me, and that is my story. Thank you for staying until the end. There was a moment in this story when I realized something simple but powerful. Silence can look like kindness, but sometimes it's just fear wearing a polite face. For years, I believed keeping peace meant accepting less, shrinking myself so others could feel comfortable. But truth has a strange way of restoring dignity, even when it arrives painfully. Standing up for what is right doesn't always feel heroic in the moment. Sometimes it feels terrifying, lonely, and uncertain. Yet that small act of honesty can protect someone, change a life, or stop a cycle that has lasted for years. I often wonder what you would do if you were standing where I stood that night. Would you stay quiet? Or would you tell the truth, even if it changed everything, and wherever you're listening from right now? I'd genuinely love to know. Leave a comment and tell me your city or country. Stories like this travel farther because of people like you. A single subscribe from you helps this channel keep sharing real stories about courage and boundaries. A like or a share might help someone out there realize they are not alone and that they deserve to be heard too. In a quiet way. That makes you part of the reason these stories matter.